Imagine for a second you're out for a stroll in one of America's storybook historic districts. Maybe it's St. Louis, Missouri, Denver, Colorado, Coral Gables, Florida, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, or better yet, as long as we're imagining, how about New Orleans? That's better. Can you picture it? Wandering the heart of the old town, the air thick with humidity and the smell of magnolias, the sound of pure Dixieland pouring forth from every window, all of it is illumined with the perfect gold flicker of the lamps that stand sentry along the roadside, flickering gas lamps casting tiny sunsets onto wrought iron balconies and century-old walls. Let's pause here for a moment, because that's not a gas lamp at all. Look closer, and you'll see an intricate cast iron pole, solid as the day it was installed over a century ago. Above it, a carefully crafted streetlight bathes the road in a soft, steady glow. Gaze further up at the ornate octagonal fixture atop the pole, and maybe, just maybe, you can make out the words stamped into the dull metal. Squint, and you just might be able to read them. George Cutter Company, South Bend, Indiana. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we are going to dive into some of the fun and forgotten businesses of South Bend, running the gamut from toys to bait to underwear to newspapers. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generous underwriting of the entire series by Andy and Tina Nickel of South Bend. And now, with all that out of the way, let's talk about the George Cutter Company. And I hope that this will inspire your next urban scavenger hunts in historic districts across the country. Because if you find yourself walking a street that was illumined in the 1910s or 1920s, there's an excellent chance that there was a George Cutter lamp standing sentinel over the roadway, and maybe it's still there. George Cutter was born in Boston in 1853, and he was born in the right place and at the right time. American electrical innovation was happening all around Cutter's early life, and his scientific mind was built for this new world. By 1869, at just 16, Cutter was already laying the foundation of a remarkable career, working for the Johnson Whittemore Company. This early exposure to the burgeoning field of electrical engineering was just the beginning. But the real turning point came in 1876. Cutter found himself at the center of a revolution, the invention of the telephone. Working alongside Alexander Graham Bell, he witnessed firsthand the transformative power of innovation, a force that would guide his life's work. Cutter was working for Bell at the time Bell invented the telephone, although we're not certain what role, if any, he played in the device's development. But whatever role it was enough that Bell sent Cutter to Russia for 2 years as a representative of the International Bell Telephone Company, bringing cutting-edge technology to a global audience. Returning to the United States, Cutter joined the Thomson-Houston Company in 1883, quickly rising to prominence. By 1885, he was representing Thomson-Houston at the prestigious International Inventions Exhibition in London, showcasing American ingenuity to the world. Thomson-Houston would eventually become General Electric, and Cutter's role as a global ambassador earned him the unofficial title as founder of GE International. These early chapters of Cutter's life paint a portrait of a man who wasn't just riding the wave of industrial progress, he was helping to create it. It would only be a matter of time before he would set out on his own, founding the company that would bear his name. By 1888, he was in Chicago, where he married Inez, and in 1899 he incorporated his own company with $5,000. Despite his brilliance and his passion, the Chicago years were not great for Cutter. He struggled to make a profit during the first years in 1900 and 1901. When things finally started to look up in 1902, a factory fire brought business to a halt. Cutter had been leasing the space, and when he wasn't assured that his landlord was taking adequate precautions against another blaze, he began looking for a different property. That's how Cutter wound up moving to South Bend in 1904, dropping $5,000 to purchase 2.5 acres at the corner of Notre Dame Avenue and Northside Boulevard, then building a factory of his own that would stand for more than a century. Legally speaking, George Cutter did not move his company to South Bend. Legally speaking, he started a new George Cutter Company in South Bend, taking cash out of his business in Illinois, then starting a new corporation in Indiana on April 5, 1905. His business partner was a man named Albert Schneibel, and their business had a capital investment of $10,000. Cutter moved into a house at 907 Park Avenue in the Chapin Park neighborhood and began to make South Bend his home. His wife Inez became very involved in the local arts and culture scene. George was chairman of the Coquillard Country Club Committee, that would later become the Morris Country Club. He and Inez commissioned architect W. W. Schneider to build them a stately home, and they spent $12,000 building the Tudor Revival-style estate at 916 Riverside Drive. That house is still there as of 2024, and you can still check it out. The Cutters tried for a while to call their home Anderson Court, but the name never really caught on. Meanwhile, at work, George Cutter won a few patents for different streetlight improvements and accoutrements, and in 1907, they began manufacturing the Arcadian-style street lamps for which they would become best known. Besides being an electrical genius, Cutter was something of a Renaissance man and a world traveler. One of his obituary writers maintained that Cutter had one of the largest private libraries in America. Cutter was an architecture fanatic. You can see that when you look at his home, and you can see it when you look at an Arcadian lamp. The lamp's defining feature is the one-piece cast iron pole, standing tall and resolute with a weight of 250 pounds. The pole itself has a smooth tapered design, punctuated by subtle decorative flourishes, a blend of classical and industrial aesthetics that make it feel equally at home on a city street or in a quiet town square. At the top, a graceful curved arm extends outward, holding a domed fixture that houses the light. The fixture, often topped with an ornate finial, diffuses a soft, even glow, providing light without overwhelming the surroundings. Every detail, from the intricate patterns on the base to the sturdiness of its construction, reflects a bygone era when streetlights weren't just practical. They were designed to inspire and endure. The George Cutter Company wasn't the only manufacturer of streetlights, but it was the one most committed to style. That's why Cutter lights are the most likely ones from their era to find in the wild, standing guard in historic districts across the country, their timeless design blending seamlessly with cobblestone streets and Victorian facades. The Arcadian-style lamps were Cutter's first success. After 5 years of frustration in Chicago, he was a hit, and his company was doing great. It was time to reinvest the profits, and when we get back from the break, that's exactly what George Cutter is going to do.
The high cost of everything, including fancy barley malt, has not lessened the quality of Miesel beer. No matter what the cost, we will not use inferior quality barley in our products, or any other ingredient for that matter. We buy the best there is to be found in the world. The result is near a perfect beer as can be produced. Try one today at the Miesel Brewing Company at 1408 Elwood Avenue. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
By 1910, the George Cutter Company was primed to explode in all of the best ways. Cutter announced a new round of stock, increased its capitalization to $25,000, and announced plans for a new 31,000 square foot addition to its factory space. On June of that same year, they provided the streetlights that stood over South Bend's Michigan Street. But George Cutter was 57 years old, and if he wasn't ready to retire, he was at least ready to not spend his winters in Indiana. That meant it was time to begin to formulate an exit plan, or at least part of one. The Cutter family spent winter of 1910 in Hot Springs, Arkansas. They spent the winter of 1911 in Miami. And before the next winter, George Cutter sold his company to the Ripley brothers from Chicago. The Ripley brothers introduced a massive increase in capitalization, from $25,000 all the way to $500,000. Armed with cash, the George Cutter Company bought out the J. Lang Electrical Company in Chicago. Warren Ripple was named president of the reorganized operation, and George Cutter was a newly christened vice president with a focus on research and development. As a part of the deal, Cutter was equipped to establish a research lab in Washington, D.C. George and Inez departed for the nation's capital on February 2, 1912. It's not known if George Cutter ever returned to South Bend the rest of his life. The George Cutter Company did incredibly well under their new management, enlarging the plant in 1912 and winning contracts to bring streetlights to Michigan City, Indiana, South Haven, Michigan, Saskatoon, Canada, and Kalamazoo, Michigan. Tragedy struck on April 7, 1915, when George Cutter died in Los Angeles while attending the Panama Pacific International Exhibition. The obituaries correctly called him one of the nation's electrical pioneers. South Bend mourned the loss of a man who had been a pillar in the community. Remarkably, despite the fact that he'd only lived in South Bend for 7 years of his long life, the city was the place George Cutter most considered home. He is buried in the Riverview Cemetery, and because he was such an architecture buff, I should note that his tomb is an Egyptian Revival-style mausoleum. George Cutter may have been dead, but his company was still chugging along, introducing its Sol-Lux fixtures the November after its founder's death. The Sol-Lux created soft, even illumination, a major step forward compared against competing designs that often cast uneven or harsh light. This is the other reason that George Cutter Company lamps remain prevalent in historic districts. Many other historic lamps are downright unpleasant to our modern taste. By the end of 1915, George Cutter Company lights were found in South America, Australia, and Europe. The company employed more than 200 and had branch offices in New York, Chicago, and St. Louis. In 1916, they started a company baseball team that would become a local powerhouse, winning the 1925 Industrial League Championship and then touring the Midwest, taking on all comers and then crushing them. Their star was a pitcher who the papers only ever called Stanley, and who, unlike his teammates, was never credited with having a last name. The final game of that season came against South Bend's Standard Oil squad, and pro scouts were on hand to watch as Stanley struck out 14 oilmen. Whatever happened next is anyone's guess, but Stanley was never heard from again and did not participate with the Cutter squad in subsequent seasons. Where he went and what he did is another one of those history mysteries that remains to be answered. In between the founding of their baseball team and the winning of their championship, George Cutter was bought out by Westinghouse in 1920, then America's largest electrical fixtures concern. Westinghouse consolidated all of its streetlight manufacturing into South Bend. The move was a win-win for both companies, and by the end of 1921, the George Cutter Company was the largest and best-known manufacturer of streetlight equipment in the United States. Their lights were in Chicago, Detroit, Denver, Miami, and Beverly Hills, to name a few. Westinghouse had clout that George Cutter Company didn't, running ads in papers across the countries, encouraging Americans to adequately light their streets. Westinghouse lobbied politicians and earned contracts that paid hundreds of thousands of dollars at a time. By 1924, the George Cutter Company, a subsidiary of Westinghouse, was doing $2 million a year in sales and had increased its capitalization to $5 million. The George Cutter Company won a contract to light St. Louis. It won a contract to light the nation's sesquicentennial celebration in Philadelphia an effort that would win them national acclaim. In 1925, Westinghouse struck a deal to buy the outstanding stock of the George Cutter Company and to make the firm a fully owned subsidiary. The George Cutter Company didn't have time to celebrate the news. It had just won the contract to light the streets of New Orleans. Back at home, it had won contracts to illuminate South Bend City Hall, the Sunnymead neighborhood, and the Riverside neighborhood. The George Cutter Company opened a branch factory in Valdosta, Georgia, and was doing $5 million in sales annually. By this time, the George Cutter Company had become a symbol of modern lighting, its products found not just in public spaces but in cultural landmarks and neighborhoods across the country. Cutter had set the standard for the entire industry, but the Cutter name wasn't going to last past the end of 1926. We'll catch up with the name change right after the break.
This new year, there are only two good places to eat: home and at Smith's Cafeteria. Start the new year right by dining at Smith's. We do all our own baking, and there is never an extra charge for a second cup of coffee. Visit Smith's at 111 East Jefferson Street, the place that makes you glad you're hungry. And now, back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
At the end of 1926, Westinghouse announced an amendment to the terms of its relationship with the George Cutter Company. Westinghouse called the move a merger, but it was really an assimilation. The George Cutter name went away, and the factory at Notre Dame and Northside became just another Westinghouse facility. This partnership provided Cutter with access to greater resources and markets, but it also began to shift the company's operations from local independence to being a cog in a much larger corporate machine. Business remained good in 1927, but maybe it was too good. The factory was constrained and bounded. There was no room for expansion. Just like George Cutter had once done in 1905, Westinghouse was looking at other places to begin again with a new facility. Of course, if good business is a problem, then bad business is even worse. The onset of the Great Depression was devastating for Westinghouse's lighting factory in South Bend. In 1930, Westinghouse closed the South Bend factory and moved whatever production remained to a plant in Cleveland, Ohio. 475 South Benders lost their jobs. It was devastating for the city, a heavy loss in a long line of them. In the matter of a year, South Bend Watch, Stevenson Underwear, and now the old George Cutter factory had gone out of business. The old Cutter factory would later become the home of the Solid Construction Company, the St. Joseph County Job Training Program, and Memorial Home Care. The building was demolished in 2007, more than a century after it was built. Beautiful homes stand at the place where the factory used to watch over the river between Howard Park and Joe Kernan Park. As for the lights, you can still find them in the Riverside neighborhood, in Coral Gables, Florida, in New Orleans, and across historic districts all over the United States. As for Inez Cutter, she returned to South Bend following her husband's death in 1915 and spent the next 20 years as the premier patron of visual art in the city. She died in 1933 and is buried with her husband at the mausoleum at the Riverview Cemetery. The mausoleum is not lit with the George Cutter Arcadian-style lamp featuring a Solex diffusing fixture, but it should be. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. Thanks to Andy and Tina Nickel for underwriting this episode and all 8 episodes in the series. Our next episode in the Forgotten Businesses series will cover the South Bend Watch Company, and I hope you'll tune in for that one next. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.